the word primitive in the Oxford English Dictionary, meaning simply of or belonging to the first age, period, or stage, pertaining to early times, earliest, original, early, ancient. There is also an example here of how the word primitive is used in association with the early church. We see primitive church, the Christian church in its earliest and by implication, purest times. This is the first definition of primitive, to be first, original, and ancient. It is from the word prime, meaning first in order of time or occurrence, early, young, primitive. First in order of development, fundamental, basic, from which another thing may derive or proceed. Of the best or highest quality or value, excellent, wonderful. Skipping the mathematical explanation of prime, we see here at the end in a fourth definition, quote, most important, principal, chief, specifically of a person, first in rank, authority, influence, etc., end quote. But when interpreted by the culture that invaded, robbed, and enslaved these primal people, the word primitive is interpreted culturally as something to look down upon, when literally it means something completely different. Like the word savage, we are culturally trained to avoid such terms as having anything to do with ourselves because of how colonial races are saying and depicting such terms. Here's the literal definition of the word savage in the same Oxford English Dictionary, meaning simply that is in a state of nature, wild. As we can see, the etymology of the word savage points to woodland and to wild. It is from silva, meaning wood and forest. Then it says, see sylvan. We'll get back to that later. Continuing after savage as that is in a state of nature, wild, we see of animals, wild, undomesticated, untamed, often and in later use exclusively with the contextual implication of ferocity. But this definition is applied to animals, not people. The first definition of savage is simply the woods, woodland, and the forest. That's it. When you get to sylvan, you see sylvan, also sylvan from the French sylvain, sylvain, or Latin sylvanus, woodland god from silva. Continuing further, we see a native or inhabitant of a wood or forest, specifically in classical mythology, an imaginary being believed to haunt woods or groves, a spirit of the woods. And again, we see a person living in a wood or in a woodland region, a forester. Here's the god Sylvanus from the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, where we see Sylvanus to mean wood dwelling, living in the woods, genius of the trees, wood nymph, rural deity of fields and flocks, abundant growth, abounding in trees, wooded, woody. And then it says, thought to be the same person as Silas, mentioned at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 19. At 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 19, we read, quote, for the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who was preached among you by us, even by me and Silvanus and Timotheus, was not yea and nay, but in him was yea, end quote. So let's add this up. Not only is a savage simply someone living in the woods, but the original term, savage, comes from sylvan, which is from the French sylvain, or the Latin sylvanus, the woodland god, from the word silva. We also see Sylvanus mentioned as the name of someone preaching the word of Christ, along with the apostles Paul and Timothy. So how does the name of a founding member of the primitive church become associated with cruel and barbarous deeds? These early people of the forest and the woods, however, who were among the most peaceful and outwardly accommodating people in the world, were turned into cruel subhumans by European and English imperialists entering the forest to cut down trees, rob the natural resources, and enslave the people living there, now called savages and barbarians by them. And what exactly is a barbarian? A foreigner, or someone that doesn't speak the Greek language. Foreign, specifically non-Hellenic or non-Greek, especially non-Roman, also pagan, non-Christian. Further we read, uncivilized, savage. It's like the word barbarous, here showing to mean non-Greek, foreign, especially of speech. These foreigners were considered uncultured, uncivilized, rough, rude, coarse. Then it says, of language, not Greek or Latin, not classical or standard, having many barbarisms. Then it says, of a person equaling barbarian, cruelly savage, harshly unkind. This is what it originally meant to be called a barbarian or barbarous. It simply meant that you were a foreigner to the Greeks and later to the Romans, that you didn't speak the Greek or Latin languages. That's all. That's all barbarian means. All of the other non-literal definitions of barbarian or barbarous that clearly come later are cultural, not literal. When we step outside of Greek and Roman cultures, we find other approaches to the same words. It must also be remembered that the ways in which we respond to certain words today is not necessarily how ancient people responded to the same words in their time. Here's the famous Jewish historian Josephus and his translated writings. Josephus' writings gives us an example of the word barbarian being used without a degrading connotation attached to it. Talking about what he is going to go over in his writing of history, Josephus dedicates his work to both the Greeks and to the barbarians, who are simply everyone else not Greek, and later not Christian. He writes, quote, "Accordingly, I have been at great charges and have taken very great pains about this history, though I be a foreigner, and do dedicate this work as a memorial of great actions both to the Greeks and to the barbarians." End quote. As mentioned earlier, when one nation extends its power over another nation and its people, it also degrades that nation. It demeans and disrespects the importance of such a nation and its original people in its own culture, especially the names and symbols associated with the leadership of the foreign culture. From birth, we are groomed for what is commonly called white supremacy. And looking literally at certain key words in American society and how we are responding to them also reveals to us the modern-day effects of institutional racism and how we may steer ourselves away from it. Looking down upon the savage, the primitive, the barbarian, as well as the nigger, is precisely the goal of institutional racism. For you to mimic the character as well as the likes and dislikes of colonists and see the world the way in which they do. This is what keeps the crime of colonialism continuing. We are all going along with it. The cultural customs of colonial rule have become, quote, established and respected forces in the society and thus receives far less public condemnation, end quote. If the savage is offensive to them, then the savage is offensive to us. If the primitive is offensive to them, then the primitive is offensive to us. If the barbarian is offensive to them, then the barbarian is offensive to us. In fact, if we are offensive to them, then we become offensive to us. Or in other words, if the nigger is offensive to them, then the nigger is also offensive to us. This is a true form of mental slavery caused by institutional racism. The sounds nigga, N-I-G-G-A, and nigger, N-I-G-E-R, actually come from ancient sounds that predate the entire English language by thousands of years, and these original sounds were royal, divine, and African. Linguistically, the most important sounds in the word nigger are the N, the G, and the R. And everywhere we see these combination of consonants, especially the N and the G, we see a connection to rulership and or divinity. Consonant sounds that are recorded today as NGD, NGS, NHR, and even NGA and NGR are among the root sounds describing the character of ancient Black kings and queens, as well as Black prophets and teachers. However, the historical meaning and cultural interpretation of such sounds and words rests upon what kind of community is describing these kings, queens, prophets, and teachers. If the relations between an ancient community and the ruler, etc., were good, then such a ruler would be spoken of favorably, and his or her basic character and actions would be remembered culturally through certain sounds and words repeated by the people of the culture. Likewise, if the relations between the ancient community and the ruler, etc., were not good, then such a ruler would be spoken of unfavorably, and his or her basic character and actions would also be remembered culturally through certain words and sounds repeated by the culture. Sometimes the same sounds and or words can have different, even opposing meanings based upon the cultural and or political experiences of the community speaking such sounds and words. We see this at the NGS consonant sound found amongst a glossary of ancient sounds located at the back of the American Heritage Dictionary. Here, we see the West Semitic NGS intending to press, oppress, and to drive. We see that NGS is the root sound of the word negus, from the Amharic negus, from the classical Ethiopic negus, meaning king, and ruler, which is the verbal adjective of nagsa, meaning to rule and to become king. Here we can see an ancient tension between West Semitic communities and Ethiopian kings, where the same sound, NGS, means both oppression on the West and rulership on the East. Obviously, the true definition is based upon the experiences of who is speaking. Over many centuries, the sound and the word nigger has gone through the same kind of linguistic metamorphosis. Here we can see the Sanskrit word niga in a Sanskrit English dictionary, meaning to cover, conceal, and to hide. The Sanskrit goes on to define the word sound niga as concealed, hidden, secret, and obscure. This, however, is the oldest interpretation as to what black represented. It originally meant concealed, hidden, and secret, like that of the Kushite and Kemetic chief god Amun, from where the word Amen comes from. Keep in mind that in ancient times, one's name was more of a verb than that of a noun. It was more associated with your activity or what you or your family was known for than being associated with the family name of colonists and slavers. So when we look at the word nigra in the same Sanskrit dictionary, meaning to hold down, lower, depress, and to keep or hold back, draw near, and attract, we have to ask, in ancient times, who was doing this holding down, this lowering, this keeping back or holding back? These appear to be the descriptions of what certain black imperialists were doing to other indigenous black communities throughout ancient Africa and ancient India. The sounds niga, nigra, niga, and naga, along with inkosi, nya, nyaga, inyunga, ingus, nigus, and negus, all predate English language by hundreds, if not thousands of years. Some of the oldest Afro-Asiatic sounds like ginger, sandal, sugar, pepper, and panther, as examples, find their roots first in Sanskrit, then on to Latin, with many Hindi words continuing right into Spanish, French, and English. Ancient Hindi and Sanskrit words like cash, dungarees, thug, pajamas, jungle, juggernaut, swastika, caste, karma, guru, avatar, ganja, and many more words are now spoken as fluent English, even though these words, their root sounds, and the cultures these words come from predate European and English civilizations by thousands of years. The African words dega, English dig, meaning to understand or understood, goy, English guy, meaning a young man of no standing, yoke, meaning okay, meaning all right, cat, meaning person, along with hip, meaning aware, and gorilla, spoken originally by African women referring to a hairy African man, are also part of English language today, even though these words and the cultures in which these words emerged from also predate European and English civilizations by thousands of years. Ultimately, many of the words that we use today and believe are original English words have come from the sounds of the very civilizations we have lost to English invasion and colonialism. Nigger and nigger are among these sounds. Most people believe that the word nigger comes from the Spanish negro, but in truth, it is the other way around. The Latin nigger, N-I-G-E-R, comes first, and from the Latin nigger, we get the Spanish and Portuguese negro, and the French nigger, N-I-G-R-E, the English nigger, N-I-G-G-E-R, the Irish negger, N-A-Y-G-U-R, and the Scandinavian and German neger, N-E-G-E-R. It was this epithet, however, neger, N-E-G-E-R, that Noah Webster deliberately chose to use as the designation for all Africans in the newly forming United States. Webster did not choose the Spanish negro, which is what we Africans were identified as in the Americas and in Europe from as early as the 1400s. In fact, H.L. Mencken, in a 1971 edition of his book, The American Language, an inquiry into the development of English in the United States, credits Noah Webster with standardizing the word negger as opposed to Negro in early American colonial language. He writes, quote, Webster, in fact, delighted in controversy and was anything but free from the national yearning to make a sensation. Many of his innovations failed to take root, and in the course of time, he abandoned some himself, such as the dropping of the silent letter in such words as head, give, built, and realm. Successive editions of his dictionary show further concessions, but many, like acker for acre and kag for keg, did not begin to disappear until the edition of 1847, issued by other hands after his death. Three of his favorites, chemist for chemist, negger for Negro, and zebra for zebra, are incidentally interesting as showing changes in American pronunciation. He abandoned zebra in 1828, but remained faithful to chemist and negger to the last. End quote. So where we could have been called negros or Negroes, which is what we were being called by the Spanish already in the Americas and the English in Britain as well as in the Caribbean, Webster deliberately chose to remain faithful to the German negger to the last. We begin the etymology of nigger with Webster because it is Noah Webster that was among the leading scholars determined to define African people as slaves and degenerates in American language, and it is his definitions of negger, nigger, and of Negro that most Americans are culturally responding to today. The word nigger, N-I-G-E-R, is not an American word. It is a Latin word meaning black. Neger, N-E-G-E-R, is a degrading German term for Africans relating to stupidity, immaturity, and ignorance. In Germany, Africans are referred to as Ethiopians or as Egyptians. Neger is the disrespectful term for Ethiopians and Egyptians, or simply dark-skinned Africans. Here's a German poster from the 1700s depicting Africans being captured by Arabs for European slavery. It reads, Egyptian exhibition and Bedouin caravan. This is what a negger was in Germany, a slave. And this is what Noah Webster chose to designate us Africans as in United States literature. This institutional racism would continue right up until the 1950 edition of Webster's dictionary, where we read the definition and description of the Negro. Negro, a person belonging to the black race, especially to the typical African branch of that race, formerly called the Ethiopian, the type being characterized by tall stature and often powerful physique, extreme dolichocephaly, convex forehead, prognathous jaws with large teeth, flat, broad nose, everted lips, woolly hair, and dark brown to sooty black complexion. Specifically a person of the typical race inhabiting the Sudan, or that part of Africa between the Congo and the Sahara, also inhabited by Hamites, Arabs, and Pygmies. Now look at what Webster is describing as Negroes and niggers, the type being characterized by tall stature and powerful physique, extreme dolichocephaly, convex forehead, prognathous jaws with large teeth, flat, broad nose, everted lips, woolly hair, and dark brown to sooty black complexion. This description, however, especially the extreme dolichocephaly and Congo parts, relate directly to a black people of the Congo called the Mangbitu, and an ancient African technique known as Lipambo. Lipambo was practiced in the Congo amongst the Mangbitu ruling class as late as the 1870s until it was outlawed by Belgian colonists in the 1950s. The Mangbitu of the 1950s were an African community that managed to absorb other African communities into its culture. Each of these communities preserved much of the ancient ways and customs of older African communities, which became scattered due to famine, drought, invasion, and war. The Mangbitu's multicultural community flourished with very high levels of technological, architectural, agricultural, and material achievement brought by the various communities absorbed into it. One such achievement was the elongation of the head as a sign of royalty, intelligence, and beauty. This is the Lipambo technique, the elongation of the head. However, such royalty, intelligence, and beauty would be quickly transformed into slavery, violence, and ugliness by the Belgian colonists invading and exploiting the Congo for rubber, diamonds, and other raw materials. It was the Mangbitu, among others, that Webster's New International Dictionary described as, quote, specifically a person of the typical race inhabiting the Sudan or that part of Africa between the Congo and the Sahara, end quote. These are the Negroes that African Americans are to know nothing about. Our connections to this part of Africa, the Sudan, Ethiopia, even Libya and Egypt, are what a colonial education is purposefully attempting to erase from our memory through colonial cultural customs and its institutions. Niggers, being described as having a flat, broad nose, everted lips, woolly hair, and dark brown to sooty black complexions, are the features of the original pharaohs, the original Kendakes, the original Negus, the original gods. But if you are culturally trained to look at words like nigger, negro, and nigga emotionally and not literally, you could be led right back down the path that you are actually trying to avoid: ignorance of your real ancestry. Flat, broad nose, everted lips, woolly hair, and dark brown to sooty black complexion are the Negro features of the original Buddha, as well as the original Krishna, which literally means the black one. Every description of this ancient nigger matches that of the original gods of India, China, Kemet, Egypt, and Kush, Nubia, all with so-called Negroid facial and body features. In the Book of Beginnings, Gerald Massey explains, quote, "The most reasonable view on the evolutionary theory, and those who do not accept that have not yet begun to think for lack of a starting point, is that the black race is the most ancient and that Africa is the primordial home. It is not necessary to show that the first colonizers of India were Negroes, but it is certain that the black Buddha of India was imaged in the Negro type, in the black Negro god, whether called Buddha or Sudnasi, we have a datum. They carry in their color the proof of their origin. The people who first fashioned and worshiped the divine image in the Negroid mold of humanity must, according to all knowledge of human nature, have been Negroes themselves. For the blackness is not merely mystical. The features and the hair of Buddha belong to the black race, and Nasi is the Negro name." End quote.